Marriage is supposed to be built on love, trust, and shared celebration of life's most meaningful moments. Anniversaries mark years of commitment. Valentine's Day celebrates romance. Honeymoons represent new beginnings. But for the victims in these cases, the most special dates on the calendar became their last. The anniversary dinner turned into a final meal. The Valentine's gift became a weapon. The honeymoon suite became a crime scene. These weren't crimes of passion that erupted without warning. These were calculated acts of betrayal that turned symbols of love into instruments of destruction. Wives who used the intimacy of marriage to position their husbands for elimination, and the courts ensured these women would spend decades behind bars for choosing manipulation and violence over divorce papers. Today we're covering wives who killed their husbands on special occasions, turning celebrations into crime scenes. What you're about to hear will shatter any illusions about the safety found in wedding vows. Case 1. Sandra Melgar. Sandra Melgar and her husband Jamie had just finished celebrating their 32nd wedding anniversary. They had gone out for dinner on December 15, 2012, marking over 3 decades of marriage. The couple lived in Houston, Texas, where they had built their life together and raised their family. Jamie worked as a businessman, while Sandra was a homemaker who devoted herself to their household. The next morning, family members arrived at the Melgar home for what was supposed to be a joyful gathering. Instead, they found a scene that would change their lives forever. Jamie Jim Melgar was dead, and Sandra was found tied up and locked inside their bathroom closet, claiming she had no memory of the previous night's events. Sandra and Jamie first met years earlier and had what most people considered a strong marriage. They were both deeply religious and active in their community. Friends and family described them as a devoted couple who rarely argued in public. Sandra was known as a caring wife and mother who took pride in maintaining their home and supporting her husband's business ventures. The couple had raised their children together and seemed to have weathered the normal ups and downs of a long marriage. Neighbours frequently saw them together, whether working in their yard or heading to church on Sundays. Those who knew the family well said the Melgars appeared genuinely happy and committed to each other. However, like many couples married for decades, the Melgars had faced some challenges in recent years. Financial pressures had mounted as Jamie's business struggled during the economic downturn. Sandra had also been dealing with health issues that affected her daily activities and mood. Despite these stresses, most people who knew them said the couple seemed to be handling their problems together. The weeks leading up to their anniversary had been relatively normal. Sandra had been planning their special dinner and looking forward to the celebration. She had made reservations at one of their favourite restaurants and had even bought a new outfit for the occasion. Jamie had seemed excited about the anniversary as well, telling co-workers that he and Sandra had plans for a nice evening out. On December 15th, the couple followed through with their anniversary plans. They dressed up and went to dinner at a restaurant they had visited many times before. According to Sandra's later statements, they had a pleasant evening together, talking about their marriage and their future plans. The dinner lasted several hours, and they returned home sometime after 10 p.m. Sandra would later tell investigators that she remembered coming home and beginning to get ready for bed. She said she recalled taking off her jewellery and starting to change out of her dinner clothes. However, her memory became fuzzy after that point, and she claimed she could not remember anything else that happened that night. What happened next, according to prosecutors, was a calculated and brutal attack. Sometime during the early morning hours of December 16th, Sandra allegedly approached her husband while he was in their bedroom closet. She had armed herself with a large kitchen knife and attacked him without warning. The assault was vicious and sustained, with Jamie suffering 31 stab wounds to his body. The attack appeared to have taken Jamie completely by surprise. There were no signs that he had been able to defend himself or fight back against his attacker. The wounds were concentrated on his torso and suggested that the assault had been close range and personal. Blood evidence found at the scene indicated that the attack had occurred entirely within the confines of the bedroom closet. After the attack, Sandra allegedly staged the scene to make it appear that both she and Jaime had been victims of a home invasion. She tied herself up with rope and positioned herself in the bathroom closet, where she remained until family members found her the next day. The rope around her hands was loose enough that investigators later questioned whether she could have freed herself at any time. When family members arrived at the house on December 16th for their planned gathering, they found the front door unlocked. They called out for Sandra and Jaime, but received no response. Growing concerned, they began searching the house and discovered Sandra in the bathroom closet, bound, and claiming to be confused about what had happened. Sandra told the family members that she did not know where Jamie was or what had occurred. She appeared disoriented and claimed that intruders had broken into the house during the night. The family immediately called emergency services, and police officers arrived within minutes to begin their investigation. When officers searched the house, they quickly found Jaime's body in the bedroom closet. The scene was immediately secured as a crime scene, and homicide detectives were called to take over the investigation. Sandra was taken to a hospital for medical evaluation and questioning about the events of the night. During initial interviews, Sandra maintained that she had no memory of the attack or how she had ended up tied in the closet. She told investigators that she believed intruders had broken into their home, attacked her husband, and left her bound in the bathroom. However, detectives found several aspects of her story troubling. The investigation revealed no signs of forced entry into the home. All doors and windows appeared to be secure, and there was no evidence that anyone had broken in from the outside. Additionally, nothing appeared to have been stolen from the house, which was unusual for a home invasion. These findings led investigators to focus their attention on Sandra as a potential suspect. Forensic evidence collected from the scene began to paint a different picture of what had happened that night. Blood spatter analysis showed that the attack had occurred in a confined space with no indication of a struggle. The pattern of wounds on Jaime's body suggested that he had been caught off guard and had not been able to defend himself. The rope used to tie Sandra was examined by experts, who determined that the knots were loose and could have been tied by the person wearing them. Additionally, Sandra had no injuries consistent with being attacked or restrained by intruders. These findings further supported the theory that Sandra had staged the scene after attacking her husband. When confronted with this evidence, Sandra continued to maintain her innocence. She insisted that she had been victimized along with her husband and could not understand why investigators suspected her involvement. However, prosecutors believed they had sufficient evidence to charge her with her husband's death. Sandra was arrested and charged with first-degree offence in connection with Jamie's death. The case went to trial in 2017, nearly 5 years after the incident occurred. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Sandra had carefully planned and executed the attack on her husband before staging the scene to avoid suspicion. The prosecution presented evidence including the forensic analysis of the crime scene, the lack of signs of forced entry, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Sandra's discovery in the closet. They argued that Sandra had motive to harm her husband due to financial pressures and marital problems that may not have been visible to outsiders. Sandra's defense team argued that she was innocent and had indeed been victimized along with her husband. They claimed that the investigation had been flawed and that prosecutors had rushed to judgment without considering other possible suspects. The defense suggested that an unknown intruder could have been responsible for the attack. After deliberating for several hours, the jury found Sandra guilty of taking her husband's life. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the crime. The verdict was devastating to Sandra's family and supporters, many of whom continued to believe in her innocence. Sandra has maintained her innocence throughout the legal proceedings and has filed appeals challenging her conviction. Her legal team argues that the evidence against her was largely circumstantial and that the investigation failed to adequately explore other possible explanations for Jamie's death. The case remains controversial in Houston, with some people believing that Sandra was wrongly convicted, while others are convinced that justice was served. The Harris County District Attorney's Office has defended the conviction, stating that the evidence clearly pointed to Sandra as the perpetrator of the crime. During the appeals process, Sandra's attorneys have raised questions about the quality of the investigation and whether proper procedures were followed in collecting and analysing evidence. They have argued that the physical evidence was not as conclusive as prosecutors claimed, and that alternative explanations for the crime were not adequately investigated. The defense has also questioned the timeline presented by prosecutors, suggesting that the evidence does not definitively prove when the attack occurred or who could have been present in the house at the time. They have pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements and gaps in the investigation that they believe create reasonable doubt about Sandra's guilt. Supporters of Sandra Melgar have organised efforts to raise awareness about her case and to fund her legal appeals. They argue that she is an innocent woman who has been wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence and a flawed investigation. These supporters point to her clean criminal record, her reputation in the community, and her apparent devotion to her family as evidence of her character. However, prosecutors and law enforcement officials remain confident in their case against Sandra. They argue that the physical evidence, including the forensic analysis of the crime scene and the staging of Sandra's discovery, clearly points to her guilt. They maintain that the investigation was thorough and professional, and that Sandra's conviction was based on solid evidence. The case has attracted attention from legal experts and advocates for criminal justice reform, who study cases of potential wrongful convictions. Some have pointed to Sandra's case as an example of how circumstantial evidence can lead to convictions, even when questions remain about a defendant's guilt. Today, Sandra Melgar is serving her sentence, while her appeals make their way through the court system. She continues to fight for her freedom, hoping that new evidence or legal arguments might eventually lead to her exoneration. The case has attracted attention from those who study wrongful convictions, though prosecutors remain confident in the verdict. The Melgar case serves as a stark reminder that even the most seemingly stable marriages can hide dark secrets, and that anniversary celebrations meant to honour love and commitment can sometimes end in unimaginable tragedy. Whether Sandra is guilty or innocent, the case demonstrates how quickly a family can be destroyed by violence, and how the search for justice can divide communities and families for years after a crime occurs. The aftermath of the case has been difficult for both the Melgar family and Jaime's relatives, who have found themselves on opposite sides of a bitter legal battle. Some family members continue to support Sandra and believe in her innocence, while others are convinced of her guilt and believe that justice has been served. This division has added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Sandra Melgar planned her anniversary dinner with care and precision, the next case shows what happens when Valentine's Day becomes the backdrop for a much more calculated and drawn-out scheme to end a marriage permanently. Case 2. Kouri Richins. Kouri Richins called 911 just after 3 a.m. on March 4, 2022, to report that she had found her husband Eric unresponsive in their bed. Responders arrived at their home in Camas, Utah, a mountain town about 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, and declared Eric dead at the scene. He was 39 years old. The medical examiner would later find 5 times the lethal level of fentanyl in Eric's blood and ruled his death an overdose from illicit substances taken by mouth. What investigators did not know at the time was that this was not Kouri's first attempt to end her husband's life. Just weeks earlier, on Valentine's Day 2022, she had tried to poison Eric with a fentanyl-laced sandwich that she left for him along with a love note. Eric became violently ill after eating the sandwich, breaking out in hives and having trouble breathing. He used his son's EpiPen to treat his reaction and told friends afterward that he thought his wife was trying to poison him. Kouri was Eric's second wife, and they had married in 2013 after signing a prenuptial agreement. The agreement established that they would not have rights to each other's property, with one important exception. If Eric died while they were legally married, Kouri would inherit his estate. This detail would become central to prosecutors' case against her. The couple had 3 young children together, and from the outside, they appeared to be living a comfortable life. Kouri worked as a real estate agent and had started a house flipping business in 2019. Eric owned a successful business and had accumulated significant wealth over the years. However, beneath the surface, serious financial and relationship problems were brewing. By 2022, Kouri was millions of dollars in debt. Her house flipping business had not gone as planned, and she had taken on increasingly risky investments. In 2019, prosecutors later revealed she had used power of attorney to take out a $250,000 home equity line of credit on their family home without Eric's knowledge, even though the property belonged to him before their marriage. What made Kouri's financial situation even more desperate was that Eric had quietly cut her out of his will years earlier. after discovering that some of the debt had been racked up in his name without his permission. Kouri was unaware of this change, believing she would still inherit his estate if something happened to him. Adding to the marital problems, Kouri was having an affair with a man named Robert Josh Grossman. Text messages recovered by investigators showed dozens of affectionate exchanges between Kouri and Grossman, including messages where she dreamed about their future together. However, Grossman later testified that he viewed their relationship more as fantasy than reality. The financial pressure on Kouri had been building for years as her real estate ventures failed to produce the profits she had expected. She had borrowed heavily to fund her house flipping projects, taking out loans and using credit lines that she struggled to repay. The stress of mounting debt was compounded by her attempts to hide the financial problems from Eric, who remained unaware of the full extent of her financial difficulties. Eric Richins had built a successful business over many years and had been careful with his money and investments. He had accumulated significant assets and maintained a comfortable lifestyle for his family. However, he had become increasingly concerned about Kouri's spending habits and her tendency to make large financial decisions without consulting him. This tension over money had become a source of conflict in their marriage. The timeline of events leading to Eric's death began in December 2021, when Kouri first approached their part-time housekeeper, Carmen Lorber, asking for help obtaining prescription pain medication. Kouri claimed the drugs were for an investor who had a back injury. Lorber, who had struggled with substance abuse herself, agreed to help and provided pills on several occasions. In early February 2022, Kouri made a more specific request. She asked Lorber for fentanyl, referring to it as some of the Michael Jackson stuff, a reference to the singer's 2009 death from propofol. Lorber provided her with fentanyl pills, not knowing how Kouri planned to use them. The request for fentanyl was particularly significant because it showed that Kouri was specifically seeking out a substance that she knew could be lethal. Her reference to Michael Jackson's death demonstrated her awareness that certain substances could cause fatal overdoses when used improperly. This knowledge would become crucial evidence in establishing her intent to harm Eric. Carmen Lorber later testified that Kouri had been persistent in her requests for stronger substances. She had initially asked for prescription painkillers, but had gradually escalated to requesting more dangerous drugs. Lorber, who had her own history with substance abuse, understood the potential dangers of the drugs she was providing, but agreed to help because she trusted Kouri and believed her story about needing the medication for someone else. On Valentine's Day 2022, just 10 days after a life insurance policy on Eric went into effect, Kouri made her first attempt. She prepared a sandwich for Eric and left it for him, along with a romantic note. After eating the sandwich, Eric became severely ill. He called 2 friends that day and told them he felt like he was going to die. The reaction was so severe that he had to use his son's emergency medication to counteract the effects. The Valentine's Day incident was particularly disturbing because it showed how Kouri was willing to use symbols of love and romance as weapons against her husband. The love note that accompanied the poisoned sandwich demonstrated the calculated nature of her deception and her ability to maintain a facade of affection while planning to harm Eric. Despite his suspicions about the sandwich, Eric did not report the incident to police or seek medical attention beyond treating his immediate symptoms. This gave Kouri the opportunity to try again. About 2 weeks after the Valentine's Day incident, she contacted Lorber again, asking for more fentanyl pills. She picked up the additional drugs on February 26, 2022. Eric's decision not to report his suspicions about the Valentine's Day incident would prove to be a fatal mistake. His friends later testified that he had expressed concerns about Kouri's behaviour and had suspected that she was trying to poison him. However, he apparently believed that he could handle the situation himself or was reluctant to involve law enforcement in his personal affairs. 6 days later, Eric was dead. On the night of March 3, 2022, Kouri told investigators that she had made Eric a Moscow Mule cocktail to celebrate closing on a property for her house flipping business. She claimed that Eric drank the cocktail in bed and she went to sleep with one of their children who was having a nightmare. When she returned to their bedroom a few hours later, she found Eric cold to the touch. The only people in the house at the time were Kouri, Eric, and their 3 young children. There was no evidence that anyone else had access to the home or could have given Eric the fatal dose of fentanyl. The drug was determined to be illicit rather than medical grade, ruling out the possibility of accidental overdose from legitimate medication. During the investigation, police discovered Kouri's online searches that painted a disturbing picture of her planning. Her phone revealed searches for information about life insurance claims, inheritance laws, and how long various substances stay in a person's system. These searches, combined with her financial troubles and the affair, provided prosecutors with what they believed was clear motive. The digital evidence against Kouri was extensive and damning. In addition to her searches about insurance and inheritance, investigators found evidence of her communication with Grossman and her attempts to research methods of covering up her financial crimes. Her phone and computer records showed a pattern of deceptive behavior that extended far beyond her relationship with Eric. Carmen Lauber eventually cooperated with investigators, admitting that she had provided fentanyl to Kouri on multiple occasions. She testified at trial under immunity for her cooperation, describing how Kouri had specifically requested the dangerous substance and how she had picked it up just days before Eric's death. Lauber's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case because it established the source of the fentanyl that had been used to poison Eric. Her detailed account of Kouri's requests for increasingly dangerous substances helped prosecutors demonstrate the premeditated nature of the crime and Kouri's specific intent to cause harm. About a year after Eric's death, Kouri made a decision that investigators found particularly callous. She self-published a children's book called Are You With Me? To help her 3 sons cope with the grief of losing their father. In promotional interviews with local media, Kouri said she had written the book with her children and that the process brought peace to her and her boys. The book featured a father figure who watches over his children from heaven after his death. Kouri appeared on local television programs to promote the book, presenting herself as a grieving widow trying to help her children understand their loss. She told one interviewer that working on the book had been a good distraction from going through the first holidays without her husband, including his birthday and their anniversary. The children's book represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Kouri's deception. She had not only taken their father away from her children, but had then profited from their grief by writing a book about coping with loss. The book's publication demonstrated her ability to manipulate public sympathy and to maintain her facade as a loving mother, even while facing investigation for her husband's death. Weeks after appearing on television to promote her grief book, Kouri was arrested and charged with aggravated offence in connection with Eric's death. The irony was not lost on investigators or the public. A woman who had profited from her husband's death by writing about grief was now accused of causing that grief herself. At trial, prosecutors argued that Kouri had carefully planned Eric's demise to solve her financial problems and free herself to pursue her affair. They presented evidence of her mounting debts, her relationship with Grossman, and her methodical approach to obtaining the fentanyl used in both the Valentine's Day attempt and the final successful attack. The prosecution also showed the jury a handwritten letter recovered from Kouri's jail cell in September 2023. The letter detailed what prosecutors called a fake story that Kouri wanted her brother to tell her attorney, suggesting that Eric had asked her to purchase substances from Carmen Lauber. However, throughout the investigation, Kouri had never told authorities that she had bought anything for her husband. This jailhouse letter was particularly damaging because it showed that Kouri was continuing to fabricate stories and manipulate others even after her arrest. The letter demonstrated her ongoing attempts to shift blame for her actions and to create false narratives that would support her defense. Kouri's defense team argued that she was wrongfully blamed for her husband's death after a sloppy and biased investigation. They claimed that prosecutors could not prove how Eric had ingested the fentanyl and that the evidence against her was too thin to support a conviction. They also argued that Eric would have been more financially valuable to Kouri alive, since the money from his life insurance coverage would not have covered all her debts. The defense rested their case without calling any witnesses, including Kouri herself. Her attorneys argued that the prosecution had failed to meet their burden of proof and that the jury should find her not guilty on all charges. After hearing closing arguments, the jury deliberated for about 3 hours before reaching their verdict. On March 16, 2026, they found Kouri Richins guilty of aggravated offence and all other charges she faced, including attempted aggravated offence for the Valentine's Day incident. She was also convicted of forgery and 2 counts of insurance fraud related to Eric's life insurance coverage. When the guilty verdict was read aloud in court, Kouri bowed her head. She could face life in prison without parole, the maximum penalty for the aggravated offence charge. Her sentencing was scheduled for May 13th, which would have been Eric's 44th birthday. The conviction brought some measure of justice for Eric's family, though it could never bring him back or undo the trauma his children had experienced. After the verdict, one of Eric's sisters thanked everyone who had worked tirelessly to bring justice for Eric. Kouri's legal troubles may not end with this conviction. She faces 26 other felony charges related to alleged financial wrongdoing in the years leading up to Eric's death, including mortgage fraud, money laundering, and issuing bad checks. These charges are being handled in a separate case. The additional charges against Kouri revealed the full scope of her financial crimes and deception. Prosecutors alleged that she had been engaged in a pattern of fraudulent behaviour for years, using various schemes to obtain money and credit that she could not legitimately access. These financial crimes provided additional context for understanding her motive to eliminate Eric. Today, Kouri Richins sits in jail awaiting sentencing, her children now orphaned by her actions. The woman who wrote a book to help children cope with losing a parent had created that very situation through her own choices. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the person offering comfort in grief is the same person who caused it. The impact of Kouri's actions on her 3 young children cannot be understated. They have lost both parents as a result of her crimes, their father to her violence, and their mother to the justice system. The psychological trauma of learning that their mother was responsible for their father's death will likely affect them for the rest of their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Unlike Kouri's methodical poisoning plan that took months to execute, the next case shows how a wife's scheme to eliminate her husband began years earlier with a teenage romance that would eventually turn deadly. Case 3. Pamela Smart. Pamela Wojas was 22 years old and working as a high school media director when she became involved in an inappropriate relationship with Billy Flynn, one of her students at Winnicunnet High School in Hampton, New Hampshire. What started as an inappropriate relationship between a teacher and student would escalate into a conspiracy that ended with the death of her husband just months before their first wedding anniversary. Pamela had married Greg Smart on May 7, 1989, when she was 21 years old. The couple seemed happy to those who knew them, and they were building a life together in their condo in Derry, New Hampshire. Greg worked in the insurance business, while Pamela pursued her career in media and communications. From the outside, they appeared to be a typical young married couple with their whole future ahead of them. However, by early 1990, Pamela had become involved with Billy Flynn, who was a student at the high school where she worked. Flynn was still a teenager when the relationship began, making him significantly younger than Pamela and putting her in a position of authority over him. The relationship quickly became more serious and emotionally intense, with Flynn becoming completely infatuated with his older teacher. Pamela told Flynn that her marriage to Greg was troubled and that she wanted out. However, she claimed that she could not simply divorce her husband because it would be too expensive and would hurt her financially. She began to plant ideas in Flynn's mind about more permanent solutions to her marriage problem, gradually convincing the teenager that the only way they could be together was if Greg was no longer part of the picture entirely. Over several months, Pamela influenced Flynn's emotions and used their close relationship to convince him that he needed to take action. She told him that she loved him and that they could have a future together, but only if Greg was no longer around. She also allegedly threatened to end their physical relationship if Flynn did not help her with her plan. Flynn was not the only teenager Pamela involved in her scheme. She also enlisted 2 of Flynn's friends, Pete Randall and Vance Latime, to help with the plan. The 3 teenage boys were completely under Pamela's influence and willing to do whatever she asked of them. They saw her as sophisticated and mature, and they were eager to please her. The plan that Pamela developed was for the 3 boys to break into her condo while she was away and make it look like a burglary gone wrong. They would wait for Greg to come home from work, then attack him during what would appear to be a random home invasion. Pamela made sure she had an alibi for the time of the planned attack, by arranging to be somewhere else when it happened. On the evening of May 1st, 1990, just 6 days before what would have been Pamela and Greg's first wedding anniversary, the plan was put into action. Pamela left the condo and went to a school board meeting, making sure that plenty of people saw her there and could vouch for her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Flynn, Randall and Latime broke into the condo and waited for Greg to return from work. When Greg arrived home that night, he was confronted by the 3 teenagers in his hallway. According to Flynn's later testimony, Greg fell to his knees and begged for his life, asking the boys not to hurt him. However, Flynn was determined to follow through with Pamela's plan. He aimed a gun at Greg's head and pulled the trigger, ending the 24-year-old's life instantly. After the shooting, the 3 boys attempted to make the scene look like a burglary by moving some items around and taking a few things from the house. However, their staging was not very convincing, and investigators would later find several inconsistencies that raised suspicions about whether this was really a random crime. Pamela returned home later that evening and discovered her husband's body in the hallway where Flynn had left him. She called police and presented herself as a shocked and grieving widow who had come home to find her husband dead. She told investigators that she had no idea who could have done such a thing and that Greg had no enemies who would want to harm him. Initially, police treated the case as a home invasion and burglary gone wrong. However, as they investigated further, they began to notice things that did not add up. The items that had allegedly been stolen were not valuable enough to justify such a violent attack, and the staging of the scene seemed amateurish and unconvincing. The investigation took a significant turn when police began looking into Pamela's background and discovered her relationship with Billy Flynn. When they interviewed Flynn and his friends, the teenagers eventually broke down and confessed to their roles in the crime. Flynn admitted that he had been the one to pull the trigger, but he insisted that the whole plan had been Pamela's idea. According to Flynn's confession, Pamela had seduced him and gradually convinced him that taking Greg's life was the only way they could be together. He described how she had used their intimate relationship to manipulate him, and how she had threatened to end things between them if he did not help her. The other 2 boys confirmed Flynn's story and admitted their own roles in the conspiracy. When confronted with the confessions from the 3 teenagers, Pamela vehemently denied any involvement in her husband's death. She claimed that Flynn was lying and that she had never asked him or anyone else to harm Greg. She insisted that she was innocent and that the boys were making up stories to try to reduce their own punishment. However, investigators found evidence that supported the teenagers' version of events. They discovered that Pamela had taken out a $140,000 life insurance policy on Greg, which gave her a clear financial motive for his death. They also found evidence of phone calls between Pamela and Flynn in the days leading up to the attack, as well as testimony from other students who had witnessed inappropriate behaviour between the teacher and her student. The case attracted massive media attention, partly because it was one of the first major trials to be broadcast on television. The story had all the elements that captured public fascination: an attractive young teacher, a forbidden relationship with a student, and a shocking act of violence. News crews from around the country descended on New Hampshire to cover the proceedings. Flynn, Randall, and Latime all agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Flynn was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. Randall received a sentence of 28 years to life, and Latime was sentenced to 18 years to life. All 3 would testify against Pamela at her trial. Pamela's trial began on March 4, 1991, in Rockingham County Superior Court in Exeter, New Hampshire. The courtroom was packed with spectators and media representatives, and the proceedings were broadcast live on television. The trial drew so much attention that people had to have tickets to enter the courtroom, and those who could not get in watched from television monitors in another room. During the trial, prosecutors painted Pamela as a manipulative woman who had used her position of authority and her intimate relationship with Flynn to convince him to commit the ultimate crime. They argued that she had carefully planned her husband's death to collect his life insurance money and to free herself to pursue other relationships. The prosecution presented testimony from Flynn and his accomplices, who described in detail how Pamela had gradually convinced them to participate in the plan. They also presented evidence of the life insurance policy and phone records that showed communication between Pamela and the teenagers in the days before the attack. Pamela's defense team argued that she was innocent and that the teenagers were lying to try to get lighter sentences for themselves. They claimed that Flynn had acted on his own, possibly out of jealousy or obsession, and that he was now trying to blame Pamela to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. However, the evidence against Pamela was overwhelming. In addition to the testimony from the 3 co-conspirators, prosecutors presented evidence that showed she had the means, motive, and opportunity to orchestrate her husband's death. The jury was particularly swayed by the evidence of the life insurance policy and the inappropriate relationship between Pamela and her student. After deliberating for several hours, the jury found Pamela Smart guilty on all charges: being an accomplice to first-degree offence, conspiracy to commit that offence, and tampering with a witness. On March 22, 1991, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, making her one of the youngest people in New Hampshire to receive such a sentence. The case became a cultural phenomenon and inspired numerous books, documentaries, and movies. Most notably, it served as the inspiration for Joyce Maynard's 1992 novel To Die For, which was later adapted into a 1995 movie starring Nicole Kidman and Joaquin Phoenix. The story continues to fascinate people decades later because of its combination of forbidden romance, manipulation, and ultimate betrayal. Pamela Smart has remained in prison for over 30 years since her conviction. She has consistently maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration, though she has also expressed remorse for her inappropriate relationship with Flynn. In 2024, she accepted full responsibility for her husband's death for the first time in a videotaped statement, which was released as part of her request for a sentence reduction. Despite her acceptance of responsibility, Pamela remains in prison at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York. She has exhausted most of her legal appeals and has focused her efforts on seeking a commutation of her sentence from the governor and state officials. However, these efforts have been unsuccessful so far. The Smart case changed how schools handle relationships between teachers and students and highlighted the need for better policies to prevent such inappropriate relationships. It also demonstrated how someone in a position of authority could manipulate young people into committing terrible acts through emotional manipulation and abuse of power. Billy Flynn was eventually released on parole in 2015 after serving 25 years in prison. The other co-conspirators have also been released after completing their sentences. Pamela remains the only person involved in the conspiracy who is still incarcerated, a fact that her supporters argue is unfair given that she did not physically commit the act herself. The case continues to generate debate about justice, manipulation, and the appropriate punishment for those who orchestrate crimes without directly committing them. Some people believe that Pamela has served enough time for her role in the conspiracy, while others argue that her manipulation of teenagers and betrayal of her position of trust warrant the life sentence she received. Today, Pamela Smart is 57 years old and has spent more than half her life behind bars for her role in her husband's death. Her case remains one of the most famous examples of how a forbidden relationship can escalate into something far more sinister, and how the abuse of power and trust can lead to devastating consequences for everyone involved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Pamela Smart used seduction and manipulation to convince a teenager to end her husband's life, the next case shows how a wife's discovery of her husband's affair led to a much more direct and violent confrontation in the very place where their marriage had begun. Case 4. Clara Harris. Clara Suarez was a successful dentist and former beauty queen from Colombia who had been named Mrs. Columbia Houston. She met David Harris while working in the dental field, and their relationship blossomed into what appeared to be a perfect match. David was an orthodontist who owned a chain of dental offices, and together they built a thriving practice and accumulated significant wealth. They married on February 14, 1992, at the Nassau Bay Hilton near Houston, Texas, choosing Valentine's Day as their wedding date. The couple seemed to have everything going for them. They lived in an upscale home in Friendswood, Texas, a wealthy suburb south of Houston. Their dental practice was extremely successful, earning them millions of dollars and allowing them to afford a luxurious lifestyle. They had twin sons, Brian and Bradley, born in 1998 and David also had a daughter named Lindsay from his previous marriage, who lived with them during visits. Clara had worked hard to build the life she wanted. After immigrating from Colombia, she had established herself in the competitive dental field and had proven herself to be both intelligent and driven. She took pride in her appearance and her accomplishments, and she seemed to genuinely love David and the life they had created together. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage, problems were developing. David had begun an affair with Gail Bridges, a woman who had previously worked as a receptionist at one of their dental offices. The affair had been going on for some time, and David was becoming increasingly distant from Clara as he became more involved with his mistress. Clara began to suspect that something was wrong with her marriage in early 2002. David was spending more time away from home, making excuses for his absences and acting differently toward her and their children. His behavior became secretive, and he seemed distracted and uninterested in the family activities that had once brought them together. Determined to find out what was happening, Clara decided to hire a private investigator to follow David and document his activities. She wanted concrete proof of what she suspected was happening before confronting him about his behavior. The decision to hire an investigator would prove to be significant, as it would provide video evidence of the events that were about to unfold. On July 24, 2002, Clara's worst fears were confirmed when the private investigator she had hired informed her that David was at the Nassau Bay Hilton with another woman. The location was particularly painful for Clara because it was the same hotel where she and David had been married exactly 10 years and 5 months earlier, on Valentine's Day, 1992. Clara decided to confront David immediately. She got into her silver Mercedes-Benz S430 sedan and drove to the hotel, bringing along David's 16-year-old daughter Lindsay, who was visiting from Ohio where she lived with her mother. Lindsay had no idea what was about to happen when she got into the car with her stepmother. When Clara arrived at the Nassau Bay Hilton, she found David in the hotel lobby with Gail Bridges. The confrontation was immediate and heated, with Clara angrily demanding to know what David was doing with the other woman. Witnesses in the lobby reported that Clara was visibly upset and that she physically attacked Bridges, tearing her shirt during the altercation. David tried to calm the situation and get Bridges away from Clara, but the damage was already done. Clara had seen her husband with his mistress in the place where they had promised to love and honour each other for the rest of their lives. The symbolism of the location made the betrayal even more painful and infuriating for the scorned wife. After the confrontation in the lobby, David began walking Bridges to her SUV in the hotel parking lot. Clara and Lindsay returned to the Mercedes, and Clara started the engine. What happened next was captured on video by the private investigator, who continued filming even as the situation escalated far beyond anything he could have expected. Clara suddenly gunned the engine of her Mercedes and raced toward David and Gail as they walked across the parking lot. The luxury sedan struck David with tremendous force, sending him flying 25 feet through the air before he crashed to the ground. The impact was so violent that it was clear David had been seriously injured, but Clara was not finished with her attack. Lindsay, who was still in the passenger seat of the car, opened her door and stuck her feet on the ground as if she was trying to escape from the vehicle. She was screaming for Clara to stop, but her stepmother was beyond reason at this point. Clara whipped the car around in a tight circle and accelerated again, driving directly over David's injured body a second time. The attack continued as Clara performed another turn and drove over her husband's body a third time. The private investigator's camera captured every moment of the assault, providing prosecutors with undeniable evidence of what had occurred. When Clara finally stopped the Mercedes, David was lying motionless on the asphalt, his body broken and bleeding. Clara got out of the car and walked toward her husband's body. She knelt down beside him, cradled him in her arms, and began begging him to breathe. Witnesses reported hearing her say over and over again that she was sorry, crying and pleading with David to stay alive. However, the injuries he had sustained were too severe, and he died hours later at the hospital. The scene in the parking lot was chaotic, with hotel guests and staff rushing to help and police sirens wailing in the distance. The private investigator continued filming, knowing that he had captured evidence of a crime that would be used in court. Lindsay was traumatized by what she had witnessed, having seen her stepmother deliberately attack and fatally injure her father. When police arrived at the scene, Clara was still kneeling beside David's body. She was arrested immediately and charged with taking her husband's life. The video evidence made it impossible for her to claim that the incident had been an accident, as it clearly showed her making multiple deliberate attacks with her vehicle. The case immediately became a media sensation, drawing attention from news outlets around the world. The story had all the elements that fascinated the public: a wealthy, attractive couple, a bitter affair, and a shocking act of violence in a luxury hotel parking lot. English tabloids nicknamed Clara the Driller Killer, a reference to her profession as a dentist. Clara's trial began in February 2003, almost exactly 11 years after her Valentine's Day wedding to David. The irony of the timing was not lost on observers, as the trial was taking place during what would have been their anniversary season. The courtroom was packed with spectators and media representatives who had come to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution had an overwhelming amount of evidence against Clara, starting with the video footage that showed her deliberately running down her husband multiple times. They also presented testimony from witnesses who had seen the confrontation in the hotel lobby and the subsequent attack in the parking lot. The evidence clearly showed that Clara had acted with intent and had continued her attack even after David was clearly injured. Prosecutors argued that Clara had committed a premeditated act of revenge against her unfaithful husband. They pointed out that she had brought David's daughter with her to witness the confrontation, showing a callous disregard for the teenager's well-being. They also emphasized that the attack had taken place at the location of the couple's wedding, suggesting that the symbolism had played a role in Clara's decision to act violently. Clara's defense team argued that she had acted in the heat of passion after discovering her husband's betrayal. They claimed that she had not intended to take David's life, but had simply been trying to damage Gail's vehicle out of anger and jealousy. They argued that Clara had lost control of her emotions after being confronted with such a painful betrayal in such a meaningful location. The defense also tried to portray David as the villain in the story, emphasizing his affair and the pain it had caused Clara. They argued that any wife would have been devastated to discover her husband's infidelity, especially in the place where they had been married. However, this strategy was limited by the fact that adultery, while hurtful, is not illegal, whereas taking someone's life clearly is. During the trial, Clara testified in her own defense, claiming that she had only intended to wreck Gail's SUV and had not meant to harm David. She insisted that she had not even realized she had run over her husband in the heat of the moment. However, the video evidence contradicted her testimony, showing that she had made multiple deliberate attacks and had clearly seen David's body before driving over it repeatedly. The jury was not convinced by Clara's explanation. The video evidence was simply too clear and too damning to allow for any reasonable doubt about her intentions. After deliberating for about 5 hours, they found Clara guilty of sudden passion offence, which carried a maximum sentence of 20 years rather than the life sentence that would have applied to a premeditated attack. On February 14, 2003, exactly 11 years after her wedding to David, Clara was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under the sudden passion finding: 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The timing of the sentencing on Valentine's Day was seen as symbolic justice by many observers, as it marked the end of a marriage that had begun on the same date. Clara was incarcerated at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she spent her time converting school textbooks to Braille for blind students. Her twin sons, who were only 4 years old at the time of their father's death, went to live with family friends and visited their mother about once a month during her imprisonment. During her time in prison, Clara applied for parole multiple times. Her first attempt was denied in April 2013, and her second request was denied in September 2016. However, she was finally granted parole in November 2017 and was released on May 11, 2018, after serving 15 years of her 20-year sentence. Upon her release, Clara was required to follow strict parole conditions. She had to live in Galveston County and wear an ankle monitor. She was forbidden from having any contact with her former in-laws, with Lindsay, or with Gail Bridges. She went to live with a family friend who had been caring for her sons during her incarceration. The case had a lasting impact on everyone involved. Lindsay, who had been forced to witness her stepmother's attack on her father, was traumatized by the experience and required counselling to deal with what she had seen. Clara's twin sons grew up without their father and with only limited contact with their mother during their formative years. David's death also meant the end of the successful dental practice that he and Clara had built together. The family's wealth was largely tied up in the business, and without David's expertise and leadership, the practice could not continue to operate at the same level. The financial consequences of Clara's actions extended far beyond the immediate legal penalties she faced. The Nassau Bay Hilton, where the couple had celebrated their wedding and where David lost his life, became forever associated with the tragedy. The hotel management had to deal with the aftermath of having a violent crime occur on their property, and the location became a symbol of how love can turn to deadly hatred. Clara completed her parole requirements in February 2023, more than 20 years after the incident that destroyed her family. She was 65 years old when her parole ended, having spent the prime years of her life either in prison or under supervision. The woman who had once been a successful dentist and beauty queen was now known primarily for being a convicted offender. The case continues to be studied as an example of how passion crimes can destroy multiple lives in a matter of minutes. Clara's decision to confront her husband at the hotel led to a chain of events that not only cost David his life, but also devastated their children and extended families. The video footage of the attack remains one of the most shocking pieces of evidence ever captured of a domestic violence incident. Today, Clara Harris lives quietly, trying to rebuild relationships with her sons and move forward from the tragedy that defined so much of her life. However, the weight of her actions on that July day in 2002 continues to follow her, serving as a permanent reminder of how quickly anger and betrayal can lead to irreversible consequences. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Clara Harris acted in a moment of passion when confronted with her husband's affair, the next case shows how a wife's need for control led her to plan a much more intimate and prolonged attack in the privacy of their own bedroom. Case 5. Susan Wright. Susan Lucille White was born on April 24, 1976, in Houston, Texas. At the age of 17, she worked briefly as a topless dancer at a club called Gold Cup for about 2 months before leaving that job behind. In 1997, while working as a restaurant waitress in Galveston, Texas, she met Jeff Wright, and their relationship developed quickly. They married in 1998 while Susan was 8.5 months pregnant with their first child. Jeff Wright was 34 years old and worked as a carpenter and handyman. He had a reputation among friends and co-workers as a hard-working man who was devoted to his family. Those who knew him described him as someone who would do anything for the people he cared about, and he seemed genuinely excited about becoming a husband and father. From the outside, the Wright family appeared to be building a normal life together in northwest Harris County, Texas. They had 2 young children, a 4-year-old son and an 18-month-old daughter. Jeff worked construction jobs to support his family, while Susan stayed home to care for their children. They lived in a modest house in the White Oak Bend subdivision, where neighbours knew them as a quiet family. However, according to Susan's later testimony, their marriage was troubled by Jeff's alleged substance abuse and violent behaviour. Susan claimed that Jeff had problems with cocaine and alcohol, and that these addictions made him unpredictable and dangerous. She said he would disappear for days at a time, leaving her alone with the children while he went on drug binges. Susan also alleged that Jeff was physically and emotionally abusive toward her. She claimed that he would beat her regularly and that she lived in constant fear of his violent outbursts. According to her testimony, Jeff controlled many aspects of her daily life and threatened to hurt her or take away their children if she tried to leave him. Friends and co-workers of Jeff Wright disputed these claims about his character and behaviour. During Susan's trial, several people testified that they had never seen any evidence of Jeff being violent or abusive. His boss described the Wright family as being like a Leave It to Beaver family, and said that Jeff was stable, church-going, and a very proud father. Some witnesses acknowledged that Jeff had struggled with substance abuse in the past, but they insisted that getting married had changed his life for the positive. They said that he had cleaned up his act after meeting Susan and becoming a father, and that he was working hard to provide for his family and be a good husband and parent. The events leading up to Jeff's death began on the evening of January 13, 2003. According to the evidence presented by prosecutors, Susan convinced Jeff to come to their bedroom for what he believed would be an intimate encounter. She allegedly seduced him and convinced him to allow her to tie him to their bed using neckties, suggesting that this was part of a romantic game they would play together. Once Jeff was secured to the bed and unable to defend himself, Susan's true intentions became clear. Instead of the romantic evening Jeff had been expecting, Susan allegedly began attacking him with kitchen knives. The assault was prolonged and vicious, with Susan stabbing Jeff a total of 193 times using 2 different knives. The attack appeared to be methodical rather than frenzied. The wounds covered Jeff's entire body, from his head down to his legs and genitals. The sheer number of stab wounds suggested that the assault had continued for an extended period of time, with Susan repeatedly striking her restrained husband while he was unable to fight back or escape. Medical evidence presented at trial indicated that Jeff had remained conscious for at least part of the attack. Some of the wounds were defensive in nature, suggesting that he had tried to protect himself even while tied to the bed. However, his restraints made it impossible for him to effectively defend himself against the sustained assault. After Jeff died from his injuries, Susan faced the challenge of disposing of his body and covering up the crime. She dragged his body from their bedroom to the backyard of their home, where she dug a grave and buried him. The burial site was in an area where Jeff had previously been working on landscaping projects, so the disturbed ground would not immediately raise suspicions. Susan then returned to the bedroom to clean up the evidence of the attack. She attempted to paint over the bloodstains on the bedroom walls, trying to eliminate any traces of what had occurred. However, her cleanup efforts were not entirely successful, and investigators would later find evidence that pointed to the bedroom as the scene of the crime. The next day, January 14, 2003, Susan took steps to create a cover story for her husband's disappearance. She went to the police station and filed a false domestic abuse report against Jeff, claiming that he had been violent toward her. She obtained a restraining order against him, which would provide an explanation for why he was no longer living in their home. For several days, Susan maintained the pretense that Jeff had left the house after their alleged domestic dispute. She told friends and family members that he had moved out because of the restraining order, and she acted as though she expected him to return eventually. However, as time passed and Jeff failed to contact anyone or show up for work, people began to grow suspicious about his whereabouts. On January 18, 2003, the pressure of maintaining her deception became too much for Susan to handle. She called her attorney, Neil Davis, and asked him to come to her house. When Davis arrived, Susan confessed that she had ended her husband's life and had buried his body in their backyard. Davis was shocked by Susan's confession and immediately contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office to report what he had learned. He informed prosecutors that a body was buried under Susan Wright's house and that she had admitted to causing her husband's death. This information led to Susan's arrest and the beginning of a high-profile case that would captivate the Houston area. Susan turned herself in to authorities at the Harris County Courthouse on January 24, 2003. She was arraigned on charges the following Monday, and her case began moving through the legal system. The unusual nature of the crime, combined with Susan's claim of self-defense against domestic abuse, ensured that the case would receive significant media attention. When Susan's case went to trial in 2004, prosecutor Kelly Siegler presented a dramatically different version of events than the one Susan had described. Siegler argued that Susan was a scheming woman who had carefully planned her husband's demise in order to collect on his $200,000 life insurance policy. She portrayed Susan as a manipulative person who had seduced her husband into a vulnerable position and then attacked him when he was helpless. The prosecution's case was built around the evidence found at the crime scene and the circumstances surrounding Jeff's death. The fact that Jeff had been tied to the bed when he was attacked suggested premeditation rather than self-defense. The extreme number of stab wounds also seemed inconsistent with a woman fighting for her life against an abusive husband. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler made the unusual decision to bring the actual bed from the Wright home into the courtroom to demonstrate her theory of how the attack had occurred. During closing arguments, Siegler had a male prosecutor lie down on the bed and allow himself to be tied to the posts with neckties. She then straddled her colleague and reenacted the stabbing attack, using one of the actual knives that Susan had used to end her husband's life. The courtroom demonstration was dramatic and effective, giving jurors a visceral understanding of how vulnerable Jeff had been during the attack. Siegler removed her high heels and climbed onto the bed in her tight-fitting black suit, raising the knife repeatedly as she showed how Susan could have inflicted the 193 wounds while Jeff was restrained and unable to defend himself. Susan's defense attorney, Neil Davis, presented a completely different version of events. He argued that Susan had been a battered woman who had endured years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband. According to the defense, Susan had ended Jeff's life in self-defense during a particularly violent episode when she feared for her own safety and the safety of her children. The defense team called witnesses who testified about Susan's allegations of abuse, including her mother and other family members. They argued that Susan had been driven to desperate action by Jeff's cocaine use and violent behaviour, and that she had acted to protect herself and her children from further harm. Susan testified in her own defence, giving an emotional account of the night her husband died. She claimed that Jeff had been on a cocaine binge and had become extremely violent, allegedly beating her before the fatal encounter. According to Susan's testimony, she could not stop attacking him once she started, because she knew that if she stopped, he would take the knife away from her and end her life instead. During her testimony, Susan broke down crying as she described the alleged abuse she had suffered and the fear she felt on the night of the attack. She insisted that she had not planned to harm her husband, but had simply been defending herself during what she claimed was a life-or-death struggle. However, prosecutor Siegler was not convinced by Susan's emotional display. During cross-examination, she aggressively questioned Susan about her past as a topless dancer and suggested that her tears were fake, designed to manipulate the jury's emotions. Siegler argued that Susan's frequent shows of emotion during the trial were calculated attempts to gain sympathy rather than genuine expressions of remorse or trauma. The prosecution also pointed out several inconsistencies in Susan's story that raised questions about the credibility of her self-defense claim. The fact that she had disposed of Jeff's body and attempted to cover up the crime was presented as evidence that she knew her actions were wrong and criminal rather than justified self-defense. After hearing all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. They spent more than 5 hours discussing the case before reaching their verdict. On March 3, 2004, they found Susan Wright guilty of taking her husband's life, rejecting her claims of self-defense. Susan showed little visible reaction when the guilty verdict was read in court. The following day, the same jury that had convicted her began hearing evidence about what sentence she should receive. Prosecutors argued for at least 55 years in prison, while Susan's attorneys requested that she receive probation instead of jail time. The jury ultimately sentenced Susan to 25 years in prison for her crime. She was imprisoned at the Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she would spend the next several years fighting her conviction through the appeals process. Her legal team argued that she had not received adequate representation during the punishment phase of her original trial. In 2005, the 14th Court of Appeals of Texas in Houston upheld Susan Wright's conviction, ruling that the evidence had been sufficient to support the jury's verdict. However, the legal battle was far from over, as Susan's attorneys continued to challenge various aspects of her case. The appeals process eventually led to a second sentencing hearing in 2010, after a judge ruled that Susan had not received effective assistance of counsel during the punishment phase of her original trial. This time, her defense team was able to present additional evidence about the alleged domestic abuse she had suffered, including testimony from Jeff's ex-fiancée about his supposedly violent behaviour. At the second sentencing hearing, a new jury heard more extensive testimony about the alleged abuse in the Wright marriage. The defense was able to present a more complete picture of the relationship dynamics and Susan's mental state at the time of the crime. This additional evidence had an impact on the jury's decision about appropriate punishment. The second jury ultimately reduced Susan's sentence from 25 years to 20 years in prison. This reduction meant that Susan would be eligible for parole consideration earlier than under her original sentence. However, she still faced the prospect of serving a significant portion of her adult life behind bars. During her time in prison, Susan was denied parole twice before finally being granted release. Her first parole hearing in June 2014 was unsuccessful, as was her second attempt in July 2017. However, her persistence eventually paid off when she was granted parole in July 2020, contingent on completing a 3-month program. On December 30th, 2020, Susan Wright was released from prison after serving 16 years behind bars. She had been 26 years old when she committed the crime and was now 44 years old, having spent her prime adult years in prison. The woman who had once been known for her beauty and youth was now middle-aged and marked by her years of incarceration. Upon her release, Susan was placed on super-intensive supervision, the highest level of parole supervision available in Texas. She was required to wear a GPS ankle monitor and could not leave the state. She also had to follow strict conditions, including attending anger management counseling and maintaining employment. Susan had no contact with her 2 children, who had been adopted by Jeff's brother during her imprisonment. The children had been 4 years old and 18 months old when their father died, and their mother was sent to prison. They had grown up without either parent and had been told the truth about what had happened to their family. When ABC 13 reporters approached Susan at her home on her first day of freedom, she requested privacy for herself and her family. She appeared to be living quietly and trying to rebuild her life away from the public attention that had surrounded her case for so many years. The Susan Wright case remains one of the most notorious domestic violence cases in Texas history. The combination of the unusual crime scene, the dramatic courtroom demonstration, and the competing narratives about domestic abuse made it a case that captured public attention and sparked debate about justice and self-defense. The case also highlighted the complex dynamics of domestic violence cases, where claims of abuse can be difficult to prove or disprove, especially when the alleged abuser is no longer alive to defend himself. The question of whether Susan was a cold-blooded offender or a battered woman driven to desperate action continues to divide public opinion. Today, Susan Wright lives as a private citizen, having completed her sentence and parole requirement. However, the legacy of that January night in 2003 continues to follow her, serving as a permanent reminder of how a marriage that produced 2 children and appeared normal to outsiders could end in such a shocking and violent way. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Susan Wright claimed her attack was self-defense against an abusive husband, the next case reveals how a wife's plot to eliminate her spouse was motivated purely by financial gain and began with a carefully planned insurance scheme. Case 6. Yuloma Walker Kouri. Yuloma Walker Kouri was a 45-year-old Cleveland mother who found herself drowning in debt when she made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. She had recently married William Walker, a 44-year-old firefighter with the Cleveland Fire Department, in a ceremony that took place just 4 months before his death in November 2013. What appeared to be a new beginning for both of them was actually the start of a deadly plot that Yuloma had been planning almost from the moment they said their vows. William Walker was a dedicated public servant who had spent years protecting the people of Cleveland as a firefighter. His colleagues described him as a reliable and hard-working man who took his responsibilities seriously. He had been married before and had children from his previous relationship, but he seemed optimistic about his future with Yuloma when they decided to get married. Yuloma had 3 children from previous relationships, and the blended family appeared to be adjusting well to their new living situation. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly normal household, Yuloma was facing a financial crisis that was becoming more desperate by the day. She had accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in debt and was running out of options to address her mounting financial obligations. The key to Yuloma's plan was a $100,000 life insurance policy that William had through his job with the fire department. Like many first responders, William had life insurance coverage that would provide financial security for his family if something happened to him in the line of duty or otherwise. However, what Yuloma did not know when she began planning his death was that his ex-wife was still listed as the beneficiary of the policy. This critical oversight would ultimately expose the flawed nature of Yuloma's scheme. She had assumed that as William's current wife, she would automatically receive the insurance money if he died. However, William had never updated his beneficiary information after their marriage, meaning that even if her plan succeeded, she would not receive the financial benefit she was counting on. In the months following their marriage, Yuloma began developing a plan to have William eliminated. Rather than carrying out the crime herself, she decided to recruit others to do the actual deed. Her scheme involved her own teenage daughter and the daughter's boyfriend, whom she planned to use to find someone willing to commit the act for money. Yuloma approached her 17-year-old daughter with a request that no parent should ever make. She asked the teenager and her boyfriend to help find someone who would be willing to take William's life in exchange for payment. The idea was that they would arrange for someone to attack William, making it appear to be a random crime rather than a planned hit. The teenager and her boyfriend agreed to help Yuloma with her plan, demonstrating how the scheme involved corrupting young people and drawing them into a serious criminal conspiracy. The involvement of her own daughter made the case even more disturbing, as it showed how Yuloma was willing to put her child at risk and involve her in planning a violent crime. The conspirators eventually found someone who was willing to carry out the attack. The plan called for the hired attacker to confront William and make his death appear to be the result of a robbery or random street crime. This would allow Yuloma to collect the insurance money while avoiding suspicion that she had been involved in arranging her husband's death. On November 17, 2013, the plan was put into action. William Walker was attacked and fatally wounded in what initially appeared to be a random street crime. The attack occurred in Cleveland, where William lived and worked, and the initial police investigation treated it as a robbery gone wrong or a case of random violence against a firefighter. However, as investigators began looking more closely at the circumstances surrounding William's death, they started to notice inconsistencies that suggested this might not have been a random crime. The behaviour of some of the people involved in the case, including Yuloma and her daughter, raised red flags that prompted detectives to dig deeper into the family's background and relationships. The investigation revealed the existence of the life insurance policy and Yuloma's desperate financial situation. When detectives learned about her mounting debts and the timing of her marriage to William, they began to suspect that financial gain might have been a motive for the attack. The fact that William had been killed just a few months after their wedding was particularly suspicious. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officials were able to piece together evidence of the conspiracy that Yuloma had organised. They discovered communications between the various participants in the scheme and found evidence that payments had been arranged for the person who carried out the attack. The involvement of Yuloma's teenage daughter and her boyfriend provided investigators with potential witnesses who could testify about the planning of the crime. When confronted with the evidence against her, Yuloma's daughter and her boyfriend began cooperating with investigators. Their testimony provided crucial details about how the plot had been developed and who had been involved in planning William's death. The cooperation of these young people was essential to building a case against Yuloma and the others involved in the conspiracy. The hired attacker was also identified and arrested in connection with William's death. Like many people who commit crimes for money, he eventually provided information about who had hired him and how the payment arrangement had been structured. This testimony further strengthened the case against Yuloma by showing that she had been the person behind the scheme. Yuloma was arrested and charged with aggravated offence in connection with her husband's death. The charges reflected the fact that she had planned and organised the attack rather than carrying it out herself. Under Ohio law, people who conspire to commit violent crimes can face the same penalties as those who actually carry out the acts. The case went to trial in 2016, with prosecutors presenting evidence that Yuloma had carefully planned her husband's death in order to collect his life insurance money. They showed that she had been facing serious financial problems and had seen William's death as a solution to her monetary troubles. The prosecution also emphasised the calculated nature of the crime and the fact that Yuloma had involved her own teenage daughter in the scheme. During the trial, prosecutors pointed out the tragic irony that Yuloma's plan had been doomed from the start because she was not the beneficiary of William's life insurance policy. Her ex-wife was still listed as the person who would receive the money, meaning that even if the crime had gone undetected, Yuloma would not have received the financial benefit she had been seeking. Yuloma's defense attorneys tried to argue that she had not been the mastermind behind the plot, and that others had been more responsible for William's death. However, the evidence presented by prosecutors showed that she had been the driving force behind the conspiracy, and had recruited the other participants to help carry out her plan. The defense also attempted to present Yuloma in a sympathetic light, emphasizing her role as a mother and the financial pressures she had been facing. They argued that her desperate circumstances had led her to make poor decisions, but that she had not intended for anyone to be seriously harmed. However, this argument was undercut by the clear evidence that she had specifically planned for William to be eliminated. One of Yuloma's attorneys pointed to discrepancies in witness testimony during closing arguments and suggested that her daughter might have been the actual mastermind behind the scheme. This strategy was designed to create reasonable doubt about Yuloma's level of involvement and responsibility for the crime. However, the evidence showed that as the adult in the situation, Yuloma had been the one directing the conspiracy. After hearing all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. They spent less than 2 hours discussing the case before reaching their verdict, suggesting that they found the evidence against Yuloma to be overwhelming and convincing. The relatively short deliberation time indicated that the jurors had little doubt about her guilt. The jury found Yuloma Walker Kouri guilty of aggravated offence and conspiracy charges related to her husband's death. The verdict was a relief to William's family and colleagues, who had been waiting for justice in his case. The conviction also sent a message that people who plan violent crimes will be held accountable, even if they do not personally carry out the attacks. On July 7, 2017, Yuloma was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for her role in William's death. The sentence ensured that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the decision to have her husband eliminated for financial gain. The judge's decision to impose the maximum sentence reflected the serious nature of the crime and the calculated way in which it had been planned. The timing of Yuloma's sentencing added an additional layer of irony to the case. July 7, 2017 would have been William and Yuloma's 4th wedding anniversary if he had lived and their marriage had continued. Instead of celebrating 4 years of marriage, the date became the day that Yuloma received a life sentence for arranging her husband's death. The case had devastating effects on multiple families. William's children lost their father to a senseless act of violence, while Yuloma's children had to deal with the knowledge that their mother had planned and carried out a scheme that resulted in the death of their stepfather. The teenage daughter, who had been recruited to help with the plan, also faced legal consequences for her role in the conspiracy. William's colleagues at the Cleveland Fire Department were shocked to learn that their brother firefighter had been eliminated by his own wife. The revelation that his death had not been a random act of violence, but a carefully planned attack carried out by someone he trusted, was particularly painful for those who had known and worked with him. The case also highlighted the dangers that first responders face, not just in their professional lives, but potentially in their personal relationships as well. William had spent his career protecting others from danger, but he had been unable to protect himself from the person who was supposed to love and support him. The insurance company that held William's life insurance policy found themselves in the unusual position of having to pay benefits to his ex-wife rather than his current wife, even though his current wife had been responsible for his death. This outcome demonstrated how Yuloma's lack of knowledge about the beneficiary information had made her entire scheme pointless from a financial perspective. The case received significant media attention in Cleveland and served as a reminder about the importance of updating legal documents after major life events like marriage. If William had changed his beneficiary information after marrying Yuloma, she would have been entitled to the insurance money, which might have made her plan even more financially motivated. Today, Yuloma Walker Kouri remains in prison, serving her life sentence. She is now in her mid-50s and will spend the rest of her life behind bars for the decision to have her husband eliminated. Her case serves as a stark example of how financial desperation can lead people to make choices that destroy multiple lives. The other participants in the conspiracy also faced legal consequences for their roles in William's death. The person who actually carried out the attack was sentenced to prison, and Yuloma's daughter faced juvenile charges for her involvement in the scheme. The case demonstrated how one person's criminal plan can have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. William Walker's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if Yuloma had chosen to address her financial problems through legal means, rather than violence. Instead, her decision to arrange his death resulted in the destruction of 2 families and the loss of a dedicated public servant who had spent his career helping others. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing it helps the channel tremendously. While Yuloma Walker Kouri's scheme was motivated by insurance money she would never receive, the next case shows how a wife's manipulation of an old flame led to a carefully orchestrated plan that unfolded the day after what should have been a joyful anniversary celebration. Case 7. Jennifer Faith. Jennifer Faith and her husband Jamie had just celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary on October 8, 2020, marking a decade and a half of marriage that had produced a teenage daughter and what appeared to be a stable family life in their Dallas suburb. The couple lived in a quiet neighborhood where Jamie worked in information technology while Jennifer focused on managing their household and raising their daughter. To their neighbors and friends, they seemed like an ordinary middle-class family navigating the challenges of middle age and parenthood. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly normal marriage, Jennifer had been conducting a secret relationship that would soon turn deadly. She had reconnected with Darren Ruben Lopez, her high school boyfriend from more than 25 years earlier, through social media and text messaging. What began as innocent reminiscing about their teenage years gradually evolved into an intense emotional and physical affair that would consume both of their lives. Darren Lopez was a 49-year-old military veteran who lived in Tennessee and had served in the US Army in Iraq, where he had suffered a traumatic brain injury that affected his judgment and decision-making abilities. He had struggled with the lasting effects of his military service and was vulnerable to emotional manipulation. When Jennifer reached out to him through Facebook, he was eager to reconnect with someone from his past who seemed to understand and care about him. The relationship between Jennifer and Darren quickly intensified through daily text messages, phone calls, and video chats. Jennifer began telling Darren elaborate lies about her marriage to Jamie, claiming that her husband was physically and emotionally abusive toward both her and their teenage daughter. She painted a picture of herself as a victim trapped in a dangerous situation with nowhere to turn for help. Jennifer's manipulation of Darren was methodical and calculated. She created fake email accounts and posed as various people, including a worried friend and even Jamie himself, to send Darren messages that supported her claims of abuse. These fake emails contained graphic descriptions of alleged violence and threats that made Darren increasingly angry and protective toward Jennifer. One of the most disturbing aspects of Jennifer's deception was her use of fake photographs to convince Darren that Jamie was physically harming her. She sent him images that she claimed showed injuries from beatings, though these photos were later determined to be fabricated or obtained from other sources. The fake evidence was convincing enough to make Darren believe that Jennifer was in immediate physical danger. As their relationship continued, Jennifer escalated her manipulation by claiming that Jamie had discovered their affair and was threatening to harm both her and their daughter. She told Darren that Jamie had become increasingly violent and unstable, and that she feared for her life. These false claims created a sense of urgency that made Darren feel like he needed to take immediate action to protect the woman he believed he loved. Jennifer also provided Darren with money and gifts throughout their relationship, using funds that she obtained through various means, including a GoFundMe fundraiser that would later be established after Jamie's death. She gave him credit cards that she paid off using this money, creating a financial dependency that further strengthened her control over him. The financial support made Darren feel indebted to Jennifer and more willing to do whatever she asked of him. The plan to eliminate Jamie began to take shape in the weeks leading up to the attack. Jennifer convinced Darren that Jamie's violence was escalating and that legal remedies like restraining orders would not be effective in protecting her. She suggested that the only way to end the abuse was to permanently remove Jamie from the situation, gradually leading Darren to believe that taking Jamie's life was justified and necessary. Jennifer provided Darren with detailed information about Jamie's daily routines, including when he left for work, what routes he took, and when he walked their dog. She essentially provided her lover with a blueprint for how to locate and attack her husband, while making it appear to be a random street crime rather than a planned assassination. On the morning of October 9th, 2020, just one day after Jennifer and Jamie had celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary, the plan was put into action. Jennifer and Jamie were walking their dog in their neighborhood, following a routine that they had established over many years of marriage. The walk was something they did together regularly, and it gave Jennifer the perfect opportunity to position Jamie for the attack she had arranged. As the couple walked along the street with their dog, a masked gunman approached them and opened fire. Jamie was struck multiple times and fell to the ground, while Jennifer screamed for help and called 911. The attack appeared to be a random street crime, with Jennifer presenting herself as another victim who had witnessed her husband's senseless shooting by an unknown assailant. Jennifer's performance in the immediate aftermath of the shooting was convincing to first responders and investigators who arrived at the scene. She appeared to be genuinely traumatized by what had happened and showed all the signs of someone who had just witnessed the violent death of their spouse. Her emotional responses seemed authentic, and she cooperated fully with police during their initial investigation. However, investigators soon began to notice inconsistencies in Jennifer's story and behavior that raised suspicions about whether this had really been a random crime. The attack had been very targeted, with the gunman focusing specifically on Jamie while leaving Jennifer unharmed. This pattern was unusual for a robbery or random street crime, where both victims would typically be threatened or harmed. The investigation revealed that the gunman had used a distinctive vehicle to travel to and from the scene of the crime. Surveillance cameras in the area captured images of a truck with a recognizable decal that helped investigators track down the owner. This led them to identify Darren Lopez as a potential suspect in the shooting. When police began investigating Darren's background and his connection to Jennifer, they discovered the extensive communication between the two through text messages, emails, and phone calls. The volume and content of these communications revealed the true nature of their relationship and provided evidence of the planning that had gone into Jamie's death. Investigators also uncovered the fake email accounts that Jennifer had created to manipulate Darren's emotions and convince him that Jamie was abusive. Digital forensics experts were able to trace these accounts back to Jennifer and show that she had been posing as multiple people to support her false narrative about her marriage. The evidence of financial transactions between Jennifer and Darren also supported the theory that she had been orchestrating the entire scheme. Bank records showed that she had been sending him money and paying for his expenses in the months leading up to the attack, creating a pattern that suggested she was paying him to carry out services for her. As the investigation progressed, authorities were able to build a comprehensive case showing that Jennifer had manipulated Darren into attacking her husband by convincing him that he was protecting her from an abusive situation. The evidence demonstrated that, far from being a victim of domestic violence, Jennifer had been the architect of a complex plan to have her husband eliminated. Jennifer was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit offence and other related crimes in federal court, since the conspiracy had crossed state lines, with Darren travelling from Tennessee to Texas to carry out the attack. The federal charges carried potentially severe penalties, including the possibility of life in prison without parole. Darren was also arrested and charged with Jamie's death, though his defence team argued that he had been manipulated and deceived by Jennifer into believing that he was protecting her from genuine abuse. They presented evidence of his traumatic brain injury and his vulnerability to emotional manipulation as mitigating factors in his case. During the legal proceedings, more details emerged about the extent of Jennifer's deception and the elaborate web of lies she had created to convince Darren to commit the attack. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that she had fabricated an entire alternate reality in which her marriage was abusive and violent, when in fact Jamie had been a loving husband and father. The case revealed how Jennifer had exploited both her relationship with Darren and the genuine issue of domestic violence to manipulate him into committing a terrible crime. Her false claims of abuse not only led to her husband's death, but also undermined the credibility of real domestic violence victims who depend on being believed when they seek help. Jennifer's manipulation had also involved their teenage daughter, who had been told lies about her father and had witnessed the aftermath of his shooting. The psychological damage to the child, who lost her father and learned that her mother had arranged his death, was immeasurable and would affect her for the rest of her life. The financial aspect of Jennifer's scheme was also revealed during the investigation. After Jamie's death, she had established a GoFundMe fundraiser, ostensibly to help with funeral expenses and to support herself and her daughter. However, evidence showed that she had used some of these donated funds to continue supporting Darren financially, even after he had been arrested for her husband's death. In February 2022, Jennifer Faith pleaded guilty to the federal charges against her, acknowledging her role in orchestrating her husband's death. The plea agreement spared her from facing the death penalty, but ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Her guilty plea also provided some measure of closure for Jamie's family and friends, who had been devastated by his senseless death. Jennifer was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again be free to manipulate and deceive others as she had done to Darren Lopez. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of her crime and the devastating impact it had on multiple families. Darren Lopez faced separate charges for his role in the shooting and was scheduled to stand trial for Jamie's death. His defense team continued to argue that he had been manipulated by Jennifer and that his traumatic brain injury had made him vulnerable to her deception. However, the legal system held him responsible for his decision to travel to Texas and carry out the attack, regardless of the manipulation he had experienced. The case highlighted the dangerous potential of social media and modern communication technology to facilitate criminal conspiracies across great distances. Jennifer had been able to maintain her deception and manipulate Darren's emotions through digital communications, creating a relationship that led to violence, without the two ever meeting in person until after the crime had been committed. The Faith case also demonstrated how real issues like domestic violence and veteran mental health struggles could be exploited by manipulative individuals for their own criminal purposes. Jennifer's false claims of abuse and her exploitation of Darren's military service-related injuries showed how genuine social problems could be weaponized by people with criminal intent. Jamie Faith's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if Jennifer had chosen to address whatever problems existed in their marriage through legal means rather than manipulation and violence. Instead, her decision to orchestrate his elimination destroyed multiple lives and left their daughter without either parent. Today, Jennifer Faith serves her life sentence while the effects of her actions continue to ripple through the lives of those who knew and loved Jamie Faith. Her case serves as a stark reminder of how modern technology can be used to facilitate complex criminal schemes and how the manipulation of vulnerable individuals can lead to devastating consequences. The case also serves as a warning about the importance of verifying claims of abuse and ensuring that genuine victims receive appropriate help, while preventing false claims from being used to manipulate others into committing crimes. The balance between supporting real victims and preventing exploitation remains a challenge for law enforcement and social service providers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Jennifer Faith's manipulation took place over months of digital communication, the next case shows how a wife's plan to eliminate her husband involved hiring a stranger to carry out a much more direct and immediate attack in their own backyard. Case 8. Monica Sementilli. Monica Sementilli was a 45-year-old mother of two who lived a comfortable life in Woodland Hills, California, with her husband Fabio Sementilli, a prominent hairstylist who had built a successful career working with celebrities and high-end clients in Los Angeles. Fabio was 49 years old and well known in the beauty industry for his skills and his work with famous clients. The couple had been married for nearly 20 years and appeared to have achieved the American dream with their beautiful home and successful business ventures. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, serious problems were developing in the Sementilli marriage. Monica had been having an affair with a man named Robert Baker, a 63-year-old convicted offender and former adult movie actor who had a criminal history that included various charges. Their relationship had been going on for some time, and Monica had become deeply involved with Baker despite his troubled background and criminal record. Fabio Sementilli had built his reputation as one of Los Angeles' most sought-after hairstylists, working with celebrities and maintaining a client base that included some of the entertainment industry's biggest names. His success had allowed the family to live in an upscale neighborhood and enjoy financial security that most people could only dream of. He was known as a dedicated professional who took pride in his work and his ability to make his clients look and feel their best. The couple's marriage had produced 2 children, and from the outside, they appeared to be a successful family living the California dream. Fabio's career continued to thrive, and Monica seemed to enjoy the lifestyle that his success had provided. However, the reality of their relationship was quite different from the image they presented to the world, and Monica had begun planning a way to eliminate her husband from her life permanently. Monica's relationship with Robert Baker had become increasingly serious, and she had begun to envision a future with him rather than with Fabio. However, divorce would have meant splitting their assets and potentially losing the comfortable lifestyle she had become accustomed to. Instead of pursuing legal separation, Monica began developing a plan that would allow her to keep everything while eliminating the person who stood in her way. The plan that Monica developed involved hiring someone to attack Fabio in a way that would make his death appear to be the result of a random crime rather than a planned assassination. She enlisted Baker's help in finding someone who would be willing to carry out the attack in exchange for payment. The scheme required careful planning to ensure that Monica would have an alibi and that the crime would not be traced back to her. Baker reached out to a longtime friend named Robert Austin to help with the plan. Austin was someone who had known Baker for many years and was willing to participate in the scheme for financial compensation. The plan called for Austin to recruit an actual attacker who would carry out the violent act, while Baker and Monica remained at a distance from the actual crime scene. Austin eventually recruited a man named Zalile Mangeni to carry out the attack on Fabio. The plan was for Mangeni to approach Fabio at their home and attack him in a way that would make it appear to be a robbery or random act of violence. The conspirators believed that by making the crime appear random, they could avoid suspicion and allow Monica to inherit Fabio's assets without anyone questioning her involvement. On January 23, 2017, just days before what would have been Monica and Fabio's 20th wedding anniversary, the plan was put into action. Fabio was in the backyard of their Woodland Hills home when he was approached by an attacker who began stabbing him repeatedly. The assault was vicious and sustained, with the attacker using a knife to inflict multiple wounds on the unsuspecting hairstylist. The attack occurred in the privacy of the family's backyard, away from potential witnesses who might have been able to identify the attacker or provide information about what had happened. The timing and location of the attack suggested careful planning rather than a random crime, though investigators would need time to piece together the evidence that would reveal the true nature of what had occurred. Monica was not present at the home when the attack occurred, having made sure to establish an alibi for the time of the crime. This absence was part of the planning that had gone into the scheme, ensuring that she could not be directly connected to the attack when it happened. However, her absence would later become one of the factors that raised investigators' suspicions about her potential involvement. When Fabio's body was discovered, the initial investigation treated the case as a home invasion or robbery gone wrong. The attack had occurred at the family's residence, and there was no immediate evidence pointing to a specific motive or suspect. However, as investigators began looking more closely at the circumstances surrounding the crime, they started to notice details that suggested this might not have been a random attack. The investigation revealed that nothing of significant value had been stolen from the home, which was unusual for a robbery. Additionally, the nature of the attack suggested that the perpetrator had been specifically targeting Fabio rather than simply looking for valuable items to steal. These factors led investigators to consider the possibility that someone had arranged for the attack to occur. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officials began looking into the personal relationships and financial circumstances of the Sementilli family. They discovered Monica's affair with Robert Baker and began investigating whether this relationship might have provided a motive for arranging Fabio's elimination. The timing of the attack, so close to their anniversary, also raised questions about whether personal rather than random factors had been involved. The investigation eventually led to the identification and arrest of the various participants in the conspiracy. Zalile Mangeni was arrested and charged with carrying out the attack on Fabio. During questioning, he eventually provided information about how he had been recruited and who had arranged for the crime to be committed. Robert Austin was also arrested for his role in recruiting Mangeni and facilitating the attack. His cooperation with investigators provided additional details about how the conspiracy had been organised and who had been responsible for planning Fabio's elimination. The information from Austin helped investigators understand the full scope of the plot and the roles that each participant had played. Robert Baker was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit the attack and other related offences. Despite his relationship with Monica and his role in organising the crime, Baker maintained during legal proceedings that Monica had not been involved in planning her husband's elimination. However, investigators had gathered evidence that suggested otherwise. The case against Monica was built on evidence showing her relationship with Baker, her potential financial motive for arranging Fabio's elimination, and the suspicious timing of the attack. Prosecutors argued that she had been the driving force behind the conspiracy and that she had used her relationship with Baker to arrange for her husband's death. During the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, more details emerged about the extent of Monica's involvement in the plot. Evidence suggested that she had known about the plan in advance and had taken steps to ensure her absence from the home when the attack occurred. The timing of the crime, just before their anniversary, was presented as evidence that personal relationships, rather than random crime, had been the true motive. Monica's trial began several years after Fabio's death, with prosecutors presenting evidence that she had orchestrated the entire conspiracy to eliminate her husband and inherit his assets. The prosecution argued that her affair with Baker had provided both the means and the motive for the crime, and that she had manipulated the situation to achieve her goal of removing Fabio from her life permanently. The trial featured testimony from various participants in the conspiracy, including Austin, who described how Monica had been involved in planning the attack. The prosecution also presented evidence of the financial benefits that Monica stood to gain from Fabio's death, including life insurance policies and other assets that she would inherit as his widow. Monica's defense team argued that she had not been involved in planning her husband's elimination and that Baker and the other conspirators had acted without her knowledge or consent. They claimed that she had been unaware of any plot against Fabio and that her affair with Baker did not constitute evidence that she had participated in arranging the attack. However, the evidence presented by prosecutors painted a different picture of Monica's involvement. Phone records, financial transactions, and testimony from co-conspirators suggested that she had been aware of the plan and had taken steps to facilitate its execution. The prosecution argued that her relationship with Baker and her potential financial gain provided clear motives for arranging her husband's elimination. After hearing all the evidence and arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. They spent approximately 8 hours and 45 minutes over a 3-day period discussing the case before reaching their verdict. The jury found Monica Sementilli guilty of conspiracy and other charges related to her husband's elimination, accepting the prosecution's argument that she had been the mastermind behind the plot. The jury also found that special circumstances applied to the case, including allegations that the crime had been committed for financial gain and that it had involved lying in wait for the victim. These special circumstances findings meant that Monica could face life in prison without the possibility of parole rather than a lesser sentence. During the sentencing phase of the trial, prosecutors argued that Monica deserved the harshest possible punishment for her role in orchestrating Fabio's elimination. Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman described the crime as a completely senseless act, driven by Monica's greed and desire to be with her lover rather than her husband. Silverman emphasized that without Monica's plotting and planning, Fabio would still be alive and the family would not have been destroyed by the conspiracy. She argued that Monica and Baker had shown no mercy to Fabio during the attack, and that Monica therefore deserved no mercy from the court in terms of her sentence. Monica's defense attorneys argued for a lesser sentence, suggesting that her role in the conspiracy had been less significant than the prosecution claimed. However, the evidence presented during the trial had convinced the jury that she had been the driving force behind the plan to eliminate her husband, and the judge ultimately agreed with the prosecution's recommendation. Monica Sementilli was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for her role in arranging her husband's elimination. The sentence ensured that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars for the decision to have Fabio attacked, rather than pursuing legal means to end their marriage. The other participants in the conspiracy also faced significant legal consequences for their roles in the crime. Robert Baker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading no contest to charges related to the attack. Robert Austin received a lengthy prison sentence for his role in recruiting the actual attacker. Zolile Mngeni, who had carried out the attack on Fabio, was tried separately and convicted of the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison and died while incarcerated, bringing his participation in the conspiracy to an end. His death meant that one of the key participants in the plot would never have the opportunity to appeal his conviction or seek a reduced sentence. The case had a devastating impact on Fabio's family and the community of people who had known and worked with him. His children lost their father to a senseless act of violence orchestrated by their own mother, creating trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The hairstyling community also mourned the loss of a talented professional who had been taken from them by greed and betrayal. The Sementilli case highlighted the dangers of relationships that involve criminal activity and the potential for people to be manipulated into committing violent crimes for others. Monica's ability to convince Baker and his associates to carry out the attack demonstrated how criminal conspiracies can involve multiple people who each play specific roles in achieving a common criminal goal. The case also demonstrated how financial motives can lead people to commit the most serious crimes against those who should be closest to them. Monica's decision to arrange her husband's elimination, rather than pursue divorce, showed how the desire to maintain a certain lifestyle can overcome basic moral and legal constraints. Today, Monica Sementilli remains in prison, serving her life sentence for arranging her husband's elimination. Her case serves as a reminder that domestic violence can take many forms, including the ultimate betrayal of arranging for a spouse's death, rather than seeking legal solutions to marital problems. The anniversary that Monica and Fabio never got to celebrate became instead a reminder of how quickly a marriage can turn deadly when one spouse chooses manipulation and violence over honesty and legal resolution. Her case shows how the pursuit of personal desires can lead to the destruction of entire families and communities. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Monica Sementilli hired strangers to eliminate her husband for financial gain, the next case reveals how a wife's desperate scheme involved her own teenage daughter and created a plan that was doomed to fail from the very beginning due to a critical oversight about insurance beneficiaries. Case 9. Sheree Miller. Sheree Miller was a young mother in her 20s living in Flint, Michigan, when she met Bruce Miller while working at his scrapyard business. Bruce was a successful businessman who owned and operated the salvage yard, and their relationship developed quickly, despite their different backgrounds. After just 4 months of knowing each other, they eloped to Las Vegas on April 23, 1999, choosing to have a simple wedding chapel ceremony rather than a traditional celebration with family and friends. Bruce Miller appeared to be genuinely in love with his new wife and was excited about building a life together. He was a hard-working man who had built his scrapyard business from the ground up and was financially stable enough to provide a comfortable life for Sheree and her 3 children from previous relationships. The family seemed to be settling into a new routine, with Bruce taking on the role of stepfather and provider for the expanded household. However, almost immediately after their marriage, Sheree began spending enormous amounts of time on the computer, engaging with men through AOL chat rooms. This was during the late 1990s, when internet relationships were becoming more common, and Sheree found herself drawn to the excitement and control she could exercise in these online interactions. She later described her relationships with men on the internet as being like a video game to her, where each man and each relationship was another level that became progressively more challenging. Sheree's online activities were extensive and time-consuming. She admitted that she did not get up from in front of the computer for hours at a time, becoming completely absorbed in her virtual relationships while Bruce was working at the scrapyard. Her husband was often away from home for long periods due to his business responsibilities, which gave Sheree plenty of opportunity to pursue her online activities without his knowledge or interference. In these chat rooms, Sheree met Jerry Cassidy, a former homicide detective who was working at a casino in Reno, Nevada. Cassidy was going through a divorce and was experiencing serious financial problems when he encountered Sheree online. Their relationship began as a typical internet romance, with both participants sharing personal details about their lives and gradually developing emotional and physical feelings for each other, despite never having met in person. Sheree's approach to the relationship with Cassidy was manipulative from the beginning. She described wanting to be in complete control of the man she was interacting with, and she spent hours upon hours building an elaborate fantasy relationship that existed primarily in the digital realm. Her motivation appeared to be the thrill of control and manipulation, rather than genuine romantic feelings, though Cassidy believed their connection was real and meaningful. As their online relationship intensified, Sheree began telling Cassidy increasingly dramatic and disturbing stories about her marriage to Bruce Miller. She claimed that her husband was physically and emotionally abusive toward her, describing incidents of violence and threats that painted Bruce as a dangerous and controlling man. These stories were designed to generate sympathy from Cassidy and to position Sheree as a victim in need of rescue and protection. Sheree also began telling Cassidy that she was pregnant with his child, despite the fact that they had never met in person and their relationship existed only through computer communications. She claimed that Bruce had discovered her pregnancy and was forcing her to have an abortion, adding another layer to her narrative of abuse and victimization. This false pregnancy claim was designed to make Cassidy feel more invested in their relationship and more protective of Sheree. The pregnancy story became even more elaborate when Sheree told Cassidy that she was actually pregnant with twins rather than just one child. She claimed that Bruce was not only forcing her to terminate the pregnancy, but was also threatening to harm her physically if she did not comply with his demands. These escalating stories of abuse and threats were carefully crafted to push Cassidy toward taking more drastic action to protect Sheree. To support her false claims about Bruce's abusive behavior, Sheree created fake email accounts and began sending messages to Cassidy that appeared to come from Bruce himself. In these fabricated emails, Sheree posed as her husband and wrote threatening messages directed at Cassidy, claiming that Bruce knew about their relationship and was planning to take revenge. The fake emails also contained threats against the supposed unborn children, designed to enrage Cassidy and motivate him to take action. One particularly devastating fake email that Sheree sent while posing as Bruce claimed that he had forced her to abort the twin babies that Cassidy believed were his children. This message was the final straw that pushed Cassidy beyond his breaking point and convinced him that Bruce Miller needed to be eliminated to protect Sheree from further abuse and to avenge the supposed death of his unborn children. The elaborate deception that Sheree had created through months of manipulation and false communications eventually led to a plan for Cassidy to travel from Nevada to Michigan to confront and eliminate Bruce Miller. Sheree and Cassidy developed a scheme where he would come to the scrapyard and attack Bruce in a way that would appear to be a robbery or random crime rather than a planned assassination. On November 8, 1999, Cassidy made the 800-mile journey from Nevada to Michigan to carry out the plan that Sheree had convinced him was necessary to protect her and avenge his supposed children. Before the attack, Sheree met Cassidy at a truck stop to provide him with final instructions and to give him her cell phone so they could coordinate the timing of the assault. The meeting at the truck stop was the first and only time that Sheree and Cassidy met face-to-face, despite their months of intensive online communication and relationship building. Sheree later said that meeting him in person made her realize that the attack was actually going to happen and that this was not just another level in her online game. However, by that point, the plan was already in motion and could not easily be stopped. Bruce Miller was shot and fatally wounded at his salvage yard while working alone at the business. The attack occurred during business hours, when Bruce would normally have been dealing with customers and suppliers, making it appear to be a robbery or random act of violence against a businessman. Cassidy carried out the shooting and then left the scene, believing that he had protected Sheree from an abusive husband and avenged the death of their unborn children. Initially, police treated Bruce Miller's death as a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence against a local businessman. Investigators focused their attention on a man named John Hutchinson, who had worked for Bruce and had recently borrowed $2,000 from him. Police believed that Hutchinson might have been involved in a scheme to overcharge customers at the scrapyard, and that this could have provided a motive for attacking Bruce. Hutchinson was interrogated extensively by police, who were convinced that his financial relationship with Bruce and the suspected fraudulent activities at the scrapyard provided sufficient motive for him to commit the attack. However, Hutchinson adamantly denied any involvement in Bruce's death and maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, even as police pressure intensified. Meanwhile, Sheree began distancing herself from Cassidy almost immediately after Bruce's death. Despite the elaborate relationship they had built through months of online communication, she started giving him the cold shoulder and began dating other men. This sudden change in behavior confused and hurt Cassidy, who had expected that eliminating Bruce would allow him and Sheree to be together openly. Cassidy began questioning Sheree's intentions and the true nature of their relationship, as she continued to pull away from him after he had risked everything to protect her. He started to realize that many of the things she had told him about her marriage and her feelings for him might not have been true, and he began to suspect that he had been manipulated into committing a terrible crime for someone who did not actually care about him. The pressure of living with what he had done combined with Sheree's rejection of him after the crime, became too much for Cassidy to handle. On February 20th, 2000, approximately 3 months after Bruce Miller's death, Jerry Cassidy took his own life in Odessa, Missouri. His suicide would prove to be the key that unlocked the truth about what had really happened to Bruce Miller and who had been responsible for arranging his death. When investigators found Cassidy's body, they also discovered evidence that revealed his connection to Sheree Miller and the true circumstances surrounding Bruce's death. Computer records and communication logs showed the extensive online relationship between Sheree and Cassidy, as well as evidence of the fake emails and false stories that she had used to manipulate him into committing the attack. The discovery of this evidence completely changed the direction of the investigation into Bruce Miller's death. Police realised that they had been pursuing the wrong suspect in John Hutchinson, and that the real mastermind behind Bruce's elimination had been his own wife, who had used an elaborate online deception to recruit an out-of-state accomplice to carry out the crime. Sheree was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit offence and other related crimes in connection with her husband's death. The evidence against her included the extensive electronic communications with Cassidy, the fake email accounts she had created to support her deception, and testimony from investigators who had pieced together the complex scheme she had developed. During legal proceedings, more details emerged about the extent of Sheree's manipulation and the elaborate nature of the lies she had told to convince Cassidy to commit the attack. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that virtually every aspect of her relationship with Cassidy had been based on deception, from the claims of abuse to the false pregnancies to the threatening emails she had sent while posing as her husband. The case highlighted the potential dangers of internet relationships and the ways in which modern technology could be used to facilitate criminal conspiracies across great distances. Sheree had been able to manipulate Cassidy's emotions and convince him to commit violence without ever meeting him in person, demonstrating how online communications could be used to create false realities that motivated real-world criminal behaviour. The prosecution argued that Sheree had treated the entire situation like the video game she described, manipulating the emotions and actions of real people for her own entertainment and benefit. They emphasised that her actions had resulted in the death of her husband, the suicide of Jerry Cassidy, and the traumatic investigation of an innocent man who had been falsely suspected of the crime. Sheree Miller was ultimately convicted of conspiracy to commit her husband's elimination and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of her deception and the devastating consequences of her manipulation for multiple families and communities affected by the case. The case had a lasting impact on how law enforcement agencies approached investigations involving internet communications and long-distance relationships. It demonstrated the need for investigators to consider the possibility that online relationships might be involved in crimes that initially appeared to be random or locally motivated, and it highlighted the importance of examining digital communications as potential evidence in criminal cases. John Hutchinson, who had been wrongly suspected and interrogated in connection with Bruce's death, was finally cleared of any involvement in the crime. However, the experience of being falsely accused and intensively investigated had been traumatic for him and his family, adding another layer of victims to Sheree's scheme of deception and manipulation. The families of both Bruce Miller and Jerry Cassidy were left to deal with the aftermath of Sheree's actions. Bruce's family had lost a loved one to a senseless act of violence orchestrated by someone who was supposed to care for and protect him. Cassidy's family had to cope with his suicide and the knowledge that he had been manipulated into committing a crime that ultimately cost him his own life as well. The case also raised questions about the responsibility of internet service providers and chat room operators to monitor communications that might be leading to criminal activity. However, the scale and private nature of most online communications made effective monitoring extremely difficult, if not impossible, leaving individuals responsible for protecting themselves from manipulation and deception. Today, Sheree Miller remains in prison serving her life sentence for her role in arranging her husband's death through online manipulation and deception. Her case continues to serve as a warning about the potential dangers of internet relationships and the ways in which modern technology can be used to facilitate criminal activity across great distances. The Miller case demonstrated how someone could use the anonymity and distance provided by internet communications to create false realities that motivated others to commit violence on their behalf. The ease with which Sheree was able to create fake email accounts and false personas showed how digital technology could be weaponized by individuals with criminal intent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Sheree Miller used cutting-edge technology of the 1990s to manipulate a stranger into ending her husband's life, the final case shows how one of America's most famous domestic violence cases began with a bitter divorce and ended with a deadly confrontation that would inspire countless television shows and legal discussions for decades to come. Case 10. Betty Broderick. Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia was born on November 7, 1947, and grew up in Bronxville, New York, as the third of 6 children in a traditional Irish Catholic family. Her parents, Marita and Frank Bisceglia, owned a successful plastering business and provided a comfortable middle-class upbringing for their children. Betty was raised with strong Catholic values and traditional expectations about marriage and family life that would shape her worldview throughout her adult years. In 1965, when Betty was 17 years old and pursuing her degree at the College of St. Mary's, she met Dan Broderick at a dance at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Dan was 21 years old and about to graduate before attending Cornell Medical School. He came from a large Irish Catholic family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and shared similar religious and cultural backgrounds with Betty, which made their relationship seem like a natural fit from the beginning. According to Betty, Dan was completely devoted to making her his wife from the moment they met. She later described his pursuit of her as obsessive, saying that he would wait for her and do whatever was necessary to win her over, even agreeing with her when he disagreed and doing things he did not want to do. Betty noted that terms like obsessive-compulsive or stalker were not commonly used at that time, but she believed that described Dan's behaviour toward her during their courtship. Dan and Betty married on April 12, 1969, at the Immaculate Conception Church in Tuckahoe, New York, when Betty was 21 years old. The wedding was a traditional Catholic ceremony that represented the beginning of what both families hoped would be a lifelong partnership. Betty had supported Dan through medical school and law school, working to help pay for his education while he pursued his career goals. After Dan completed his education, the couple moved to California, where Dan established himself as a successful medical malpractice attorney. He built a thriving law practice in San Diego and became one of the most prominent lawyers in the area, earning substantial income that allowed the family to live a very comfortable lifestyle. Betty focused on being a homemaker and raising their 4 children, Kim, Lee, Dan Jr., and Rhett. For many years, the Broderick family appeared to be living the American dream. They had a beautiful home in an upscale San Diego neighborhood, financial security, and 4 healthy children who were involved in various activities and sports. Dan's legal career continued to flourish, and he became well known in the San Diego legal community for his skill and success in handling complex medical malpractice cases. However, beneath the surface of their apparently successful marriage, serious problems were developing. Betty later claimed that Dan had become increasingly controlling and emotionally abusive as his career advanced and his income grew. She said that he would belittle her contributions to their family and make her feel worthless and unappreciated for the sacrifices she had made to support his career. Betty also alleged that Dan was having affairs with other women, though these claims were disputed by Dan and his supporters. She said that his behaviour toward her had changed dramatically over the years, and that he no longer treated her with the love and respect that had characterised their early relationship. According to Betty, Dan had become arrogant and dismissive of her feelings and concerns. The situation became much more complicated when Dan hired Linda Kolkina as his legal assistant in the early 1980s. Linda was a young, attractive woman who had moved to San Diego from the Midwest and was working in the legal field. Betty immediately became suspicious of Linda's relationship with Dan and believed that they were having an affair, though both Dan and Linda initially denied any romantic involvement. Betty's suspicions about Dan and Linda's relationship created increasing tension in the household. She began confronting Dan about his relationship with his assistant and demanding that he fire Linda or end their professional relationship. However, Dan refused to dismiss Linda and continued working closely with her, which only increased Betty's anger and paranoia about what was happening between them. The marriage deteriorated rapidly as Betty became more convinced that Dan was having an affair with Linda and was planning to leave her for the younger woman. Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic and confrontational as she tried to force Dan to choose between his wife and his assistant. She would call his office repeatedly, leave angry messages, and confront both Dan and Linda about their relationship. In 1985, Dan finally confirmed Betty's worst fears by filing for divorce and moving out of the family home to live with Linda. The revelation that her suspicions had been correct and that Dan was indeed leaving her for his assistant sent Betty into a spiral of rage and desperation that would consume her life for the next several years. The divorce proceedings would prove to be bitter and contentious, with both sides fighting over custody of the children and division of assets. Dan's divorce strategy appeared to be designed to minimize Betty's financial settlement and to portray her as an unfit mother who should have limited custody of their children. He used his legal expertise and connections in the San Diego legal community to his advantage, hiring some of the best divorce attorneys available and using every legal tactic possible to achieve his goals. Throughout the divorce proceedings, which lasted several years, Betty felt that she was being systematically destroyed by Dan and his legal team. She believed that he was using his wealth and influence to turn the legal system against her and to punish her for opposing his relationship with Linda. The stress of the divorce and custody battle took a severe toll on Betty's mental health and emotional stability. Betty's behavior during the divorce became increasingly desperate and destructive. She would drive by Dan and Linda's home at all hours, leave threatening messages on their answering machine, and engage in various acts of harassment designed to make their lives miserable. She felt that she had been betrayed and abandoned after sacrificing her own career and youth to support Dan's success. The final settlement of the divorce was devastating to Betty, who felt that she had been cheated out of her fair share of the assets that she had helped Dan accumulate during their marriage. She was awarded a monthly allowance that she considered inadequate, and she felt that the custody arrangement gave Dan too much control over their children. The settlement represented the final destruction of everything Betty had worked to build during her adult life. 1 month before Dan and Linda's wedding, Betty purchased a Smith & Wesson revolver. This purchase would later be seen as evidence of premeditation in the events that followed. Betty's mental state had continued to deteriorate as she watched Dan and Linda plan their wedding and move forward with their lives, while she struggled to rebuild hers from the ruins of the divorce. On November 5th, 1989, 7 months after Dan and Linda were married, Betty drove to Dan's house at 1041 Cypress Avenue in the Marston Hills neighborhood near Balboa Park in San Diego. She had taken a key to the house from her daughter Kim, which gave her access to the home where Dan and Linda were sleeping. Betty entered the house in the early morning hours while the couple were asleep in their bed. The attack occurred at approximately 5:30 a.m. as Dan and Linda lay sleeping in their bedroom. Betty shot Linda twice, with bullets hitting her in the head and chest, causing her to die instantly. Dan was shot once in the chest as he apparently reached for the phone, presumably to call for help. Evidence presented at trial indicated that Betty had removed the phone and answering machine from the bedroom to prevent Dan from calling for assistance. After the shooting, Betty left the scene and contacted her daughter Lee and Lee's boyfriend before eventually turning herself in to police. She never denied that she had pulled the trigger, but she maintained that she had not planned to take their lives and that the shooting had been the result of her emotional state rather than premeditation. Betty claimed that she had been startled by Linda screaming and had fired the gun in response to the shock. The double shooting sent shockwaves through the San Diego community, where Dan had been a prominent and well-known attorney. The case immediately attracted massive media attention due to the high-profile nature of the victims and the dramatic circumstances surrounding the crime. The story had all the elements that fascinated the public: wealth, infidelity, divorce, and ultimate revenge. Betty was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree offence in connection with the deaths of Dan and Linda. The prosecution argued that Betty had carefully planned the attack and had purchased the gun with the intention of using it to eliminate her ex-husband and his new wife. They presented evidence of her increasingly erratic behaviour during the divorce and the purchase of the weapon as proof of premeditation. Betty's first trial began in 1991 and ended with a hung jury when 2 jurors held out for manslaughter charges rather than first-degree offence, citing lack of intent to commit premeditated acts. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict and Judge Thomas J. Whelan declared a mistrial. This outcome was frustrating for both the prosecution and the victims' families, who had hoped for a clear resolution to the case. The second trial began on December 11, 1991, with essentially the same evidence and arguments presented by both sides. Prosecutor Kerry Wells argued that Betty was a calculated individual who had planned and schemed to eliminate her ex-husband, while the defense claimed that she was a battered woman who had been driven over the edge by years of psychological, physical, and mental abuse inflicted by Dan. Betty's defense team argued that she had suffered from years of emotional abuse during her marriage, and that the stress of the divorce proceedings had pushed her beyond her breaking point. They presented evidence that Dan had been controlling and manipulative throughout their relationship, and that his behaviour during the divorce had been designed to destroy Betty financially and emotionally. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence of Betty's threatening behaviour toward Dan and Linda in the months leading up to the shooting. They played recordings of angry voice messages that Betty had left on their answering machine, and presented testimony from witnesses who had observed her erratic and threatening behaviour during the divorce proceedings. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, working for the prosecution, diagnosed Betty with histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders. Other mental health experts who evaluated Betty reached similar conclusions about her psychological state, though they disagreed about whether these conditions justified her actions or provided mitigating factors for sentencing purposes. The second trial resulted in a conviction when the jury found Betty guilty on 2 counts of second-degree offence, rather than the first-degree charges that prosecutors had sought. The jury apparently accepted some of the defence arguments about Betty's mental state and the abuse she had suffered, but they rejected her claims that the shooting had been unpremeditated or justified. Betty was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life in prison, plus an additional 2 years for the illegal use of a firearm. The sentence meant that she would serve a minimum of 32 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The judge's decision to impose consecutive, rather than concurrent sentences, ensured that Betty would spend a significant portion of her remaining life behind bars. Betty has been incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California, since her conviction. She has consistently maintained that she did not plan to take Dan and Linda's lives, and that the shooting was the result of her emotional breakdown rather than calculated revenge. However, her appeals of the conviction have been unsuccessful, and she remains in prison more than 3 decades after the crime. The Broderick case became a cultural phenomenon that inspired numerous books, documentaries, television movies, and eventually an 8-episode miniseries that aired in 2020. The story continues to fascinate people because it touches on universal themes of marriage, divorce, infidelity, and the destructive power of rage and jealousy when taken to their ultimate extreme. The case also sparked ongoing debates about domestic violence, the legal system's treatment of women in divorce proceedings, and the question of whether emotional abuse can justify violent retaliation. Some people view Betty as a victim who was pushed too far by an abusive and controlling husband, while others see her as a privileged woman who committed acts of revenge when she did not get her way in the divorce. Betty's story has been analysed by legal experts, mental health professionals, and domestic violence advocates who have used her case to discuss broader issues about marriage, divorce, and the potential for domestic situations to escalate into violence. The case highlights the complex dynamics that can exist in relationships where there are significant power imbalances and competing claims about abuse and victimization. Today, Betty Broderick remains in prison as one of California's most notorious female offenders. Her case continues to generate discussion and debate more than 30 years after the crime, serving as a stark reminder of how bitter divorce proceedings and personal betrayal can escalate into tragic and irreversible violence that destroys multiple families and communities. The Broderick case represents the ultimate failure of the legal and mental health systems to intervene effectively in a situation that was spiraling toward violence. Despite numerous warning signs and opportunities for intervention, the conflict between Dan and Betty was allowed to escalate until it reached its tragic and inevitable conclusion on that November morning in 1989. These 10 cases reveal a disturbing pattern of how special occasions and significant dates can become the backdrop for the most intimate betrayals imaginable, showing that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those who promise to love and protect us until death do us part. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.